Hi and welcome to this episode of my Worldbuilding podcast. A while back I started this project and I promised then that I would take a step back from time to time and think a bit out loud on how the project is moving along. This is the first reflection of this kind, and it will center around the question how to get started with world building. This won't be anything like a definitive guide, but just a review of how I personally approached this challenge. But I will also use the opportunity and walk you through the setup I have created for myself during these first months, covering the process from gathering inspiration, engaging in different explorations, to creating different final works, and then sharing them with others. This video is going to be pretty much centered around world building, but I think many of these ideas apply to creative writing and fictional creations in general. Getting started with world building is difficult because it's an extremely vast topic, of course. You're literally trying to create an entire conceptual world. And a natural response to this is to reduce complexity and find abstractions that neatly summarize the entirety of a fictional world in a conceptual scheme. Hence, there are a lot of tools that explain the interconnections between all different aspects of a fictional world. For instance, how a culture is related to religion, to social order, politics, technology, economy, and natural environments, and how all of these interrelate. And what these tools are after is to holistically map the fundamental domains of human life to create a consistent and coherent whole. Therefore, they work great if you have questions such as which religions would be most popular in these different groups within the social order of this particular society. But if you're just getting started, you will not be able to answer these questions because there's nothing there yet to give any qualified answer. Don't get me wrong, this must not have anything to do with whether the tools in question are good or bad, and I will link to a good one I saw on Reddit below. What matters is to be clear about what kind of problems these tools are trying to solve, and if these are the problems you have at your current stage. In the case of holistic analytical tools, they are a bit similar to a business model canvas that helps you to map out all the important activities and success factors for a running business, where you ask yourself questions such as, how should I optimize my customer service activities so that my clients are happy and keep buying my products? But this is not a good question to ask if you haven't decided what kind of company you should build in the first place. At that stage, what you should be asking yourself is, what should be the purpose of your company? So that probably you would be better off using methodologies that help you identify certain kinds of problems that your company should devote itself to solving, such as design thinking, where you go out to interview and observe people to see what they're struggling with and how they might be helped. Applying this to the case of world building, this means that while I am sure that I will eventually work with more holistic tools, I'm not doing so now because they're not the right tools for the current stage of the project. Because right now it's not about achieving coherence and completeness, but about creating a fundament by getting an understanding of the essence of the whole project. So rather than a map, what I need is an anchor. Consequently, the tools I'm working with are catered towards making quick but meaningful explorations possible that can later be assembled and refined into a coherent whole. But these are short adventures, and I will always return to my anchor. I already introduced these tools in the first video I made in this series, but at that time I hadn't worked with them yet, so I will now elaborate a bit more on when and how to apply them best. The first tool is very much about defining an anchor for the project. It is what I introduced as my world building premise. Now, this is just a single sentence, but it is enough for a whole year of creative explorations. It does not need to get more complicated than this, because this step is really about finding the right anchor for your whole endeavor, something that you are genuinely interested in, that resonates well with you, and that drives the whole effort forward, rather than finding something very elaborate and complex. So the question is, well, how do I find the right anchor then? And this is where inspiration comes into play. And this is rather difficult to describe because it's subjective and much of it we aren't aware of. But it's obviously very important when getting started, so I don't want to just dismiss it here. Now, obviously, the works of others play a big part in this, and I have assembled a reading list as well as a music playlist of 20 titles each that have been formative for my personal project. You can find a link to both in the description below, but keep in mind that they are nothing like my recommendation of what you should read or listen to when you are getting started with world building. They're just collections of what happens to do the trick for me, and for you the answer will likely be an entirely different one. What matters is this: if it comes to the stages of inspiration and exploration, what I try to avoid completely is to evaluate every experience and put it into categories of this or that genre or market niche, of what I like and don't like, of what is good or bad storytelling to me, and so on. I'm sure that these are suitable ways to build a product, but they're exceptionally poor ways to engage in an open-minded inquiry into what I care about and what possible imaginations lie hidden somewhere in my mind. So rather than looking at the works of others, be that music, writing, or drawings, as templates and goals that provide me with material and criteria for my project, I look at them as conversation partners that are pondering about similar questions and problems. And I try to ask myself, what kind of experiences do these works communicate? How is life portrayed in these works? What kind of feelings and thoughts do these works evoke? And how do they relate to what I care about at large? These are questions that are not restricted to any specific medium or genre, and to be completely honest, I rarely ever read fantasy literature, because I find much of it stereotypical and kind of trapped in a niche created by the works of people such as Tolkien and Wagner. Now, this is very likely just my ignorance speaking. Also, these people did not work with a blank canvas at all. In fact, their works are very much creative adaptations of cultural collective world building, as done through mythologies and religions. So this isn't really about originality in its own right. The point is that they didn't have the option of doing world building inside an established frame and culture. So they provide good references when asking the question, what could be the purpose of world building in the first place? I don't want to dive into what they thought of this question. There's a lot of stuff online anyways. What matters to me is that they didn't get around asking themselves why they would spend their lives with making a huge deal out of fairy tales about imaginary creatures and people. And I think asking for purposes is arguably the most important thing to do if it comes to the inspirational drivers of a project. It kind of provides you with a compass, to complete the metaphor here. Now let me, as a reference case, give you a description of where my personal compass points to, what purpose I want to pursue with my project, without this necessarily implying anything for anyone else. From my point of view, imagining alternative ways to live life provides a space for an exploration of our real concerns in how we live our lives, of the things that make us flourish or suffer, of what a good life means for us, and how we should think about virtues or flaws in our lives. The underlying hope is that world building can serve to articulate critical perspectives on the real world, but that since it's fictional, it can do so in ways that are not authoritative and definitive, but inquisitive and explorative. In the particular case of my culturally inspired approach, I hope that it can provide a playground to ask how we experience life in different cultural settings, as they just happen to form historically, and thereby some sense of human solidarity beyond the cultural contingencies that set us apart. And over time, I hope that this project will not only provide such an avenue for myself, but also for others through more interactive formats. In short, I intend to use world building as a way to reflect on life, and to eventually create spaces for a critically reflective conversation on life. And this defines the purpose of this whole project for me. Now, with that in mind, let's quickly revisit my world building premise and see why it works for me. It works because it just provides an acute way to manifest this question in the context of my fictional world. It makes the question how the other experiences their life a central pillar of social life for these different cultures, but in a way that is radically different from the real world in one particular aspect, which is that in the real world, human beings don't have a means to directly make their emotional lives accessible within the experiences of others. Besides this intimate connection to the essential purpose of my project, the premise has worked well for me because it sits comfortably between general and specific, both in its implications for the world building. It pertains to many important things, but it can be localized easily. It's literally tangible as a physical object, but also in terms of my creative process, because it allows for ready association without dictating any specific consequences. I know all of this does not yield a go-to guide of how to define the perfect anchor for your project, but I hope it makes it sufficiently clear how I am going about this. Very likely for you it's going to be different, but I think the most important question here is what you really care about in your life and how your creative project could enable you to inquire into this with curiosity and open-mindedness. The other tools I have introduced in my first video centered all around specific avenues of experimentation. What these tools do for me is to structure my little explorative adventures around my creative anchor, and the key therefore isn't that these different questions yield some holistic and polished result. They're just a mental guide to quickly get some interesting core ideas, little dots to put on the map that can later on be connected for a larger picture. Specifically, the questions I am asking here are all catered towards envisioning what possible implications my world-building premise could have for a given culture. And what paid out well here is to have some very rough historical examples. And I can't recommend Wikipedia enough for this, which however aren't applied rigorously, but are just ideas at the back of my head that can be recombined and transformed at will. So, depending on what will be your world-building premise, you may want to use different questions here. And I think this also outlines again how important it is to have a good anchor, because even the most systematic approach will not do much if the substance is lacking. On a practical level, I always restrict myself to a single handwritten page of information for these explorations, and I'm using whatever space I can get from that, but never more, so there's a natural limit that I can't go past. Looking back at working with these tools so far, the Ways of Life snapshot has worked well for me, and I will just keep using this. The historical era snapshot I felt was already too heavy conceptually, so I made it even simpler and instead just used a single page with 4 sections to write down ideas for events during the early, middle and late period of the era, as well as one for the transition to the next. So the tools I'm currently using remain rather simple and limited. In any case, I have created a document where I will collect all the tools I'm going to use during the project, and you can download that for free from the description below. If you end up using any of these tools, please do share your experience and what worked or did not work well. On a more tangible level, I have started using different notebooks for different purposes, which are each tailored to making the specific task efficient and enjoyable. Meaning I use a sketchbook for quick, messy drawings, and a music notebook with staff lines to jot down musical ideas. For the conceptual ideas, I use this A4 notebook for the systematic ideation, which I've been talking about, and then I have 2 little books to note down world building related ideas and general thoughts, which are self-made and which aren't supposed to be rigid or systematic. They're just these beautiful little gems so that it's enjoyable to fill them with personal ideas. Now, the next step is to create actual works of art, and this is a whole multiverse of its own, so I will not get into this here. I've already created a first map making tutorial, and more will follow, and in the image I have highlighted what different tools I use to create my maps, compositions and drawings, which I will start sharing very soon. The only thing worth mentioning here is that everything I create at the moment is still super exploratory. I'm just basically experimenting with different media and art forms to find a multisensory language that helps me to bring the world building alive. And the gist here is that this whole project provides me with the material and motivation to explore new art forms that I'm not yet proficient in. And it also allows for these different creations to inspire each other, to yield multi-perspective representations of the fictional world. But I think this is something that will become clearer once I have enough material to combine these different works, which I will start exploring in the next videos. Instead, I want to end on some thoughts I had around sharing completed works with others. Again, this is a rather vague but impactful topic, so I think it's worth making up your mind on, especially if it comes to the motivation that drives or buries a whole project. I think an important step in getting started with a project that you can happily put hundreds of hours into without getting paid for it is to evaluate what would be a good or bad result for you and what are the criteria you want to subject your work to. The reason I mention that here is firstly because I have been thinking about it a lot as I have started to share my own works, and because I see a tendency in the way many people online talk about creative endeavors, where we tacitly accept that a good result is always a popular result, one that a lot of people engage with, or something that is commercially successful. But the thing here is that neither will be helpful for your creative endeavor in its own right, because it does not provide you with new inspiration. And the bigger problem is that the things which are most important for the creative process aren't necessarily the things that attract a lot of interest. For instance, I'm currently spending a lot of time getting into musical composition, but it is safe to conclude from my experience so far that I would be better advised to put that time into creating map-making tutorials instead, if creating an audience were the primary goal. At the same time, some of the coolest feedback I got when sharing my work is from the compositions, because I'm running this little experiment with them where I am not revealing what these compositions are about, to instead leave a space for others to say what they are about for them. And some of you have been sharing really cool impressions that were impressively close to my own, and which I was really grateful to read. Rather than just going by what happens to be popular, it seems important to me that ultimately it's up to you to define the purpose of your project, and therefore to also define the criteria to judge whether your project is going well or not. And this is why all this inquiry into purpose and what you care about is important as well, because else the only thing to go by is what other people will have to say about your work. But then you're already designing a product for an audience. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's something you should be clear about. I am personally trying to draw this line very clearly for myself and distinguish between things I do for an audience, such as this video or running a pen and paper game, where it really is up to others to define the criteria, and the creative activities at the center of the project on the other hand. And the goal there is that they provide me with a space for honest and open-ended inquiry and expression. And sustaining that as such is something that requires active commitment. And I can imagine that this is so for many people with creative ambitions. So I thought this might be helpful to talk about. In any case, these were just some general ideas based on what I thought might be interesting to explore and what isn't talked about that much, but maybe should be. But let me know if this was helpful and what you would like to see in the future in these reflections. And on that note, let me say that I'm super grateful for every reaction so far, and I would be very excited if this project at some point would yield some bigger works that mean something to someone other than me. So if you have any ideas around that, please share them too. In any case, I wish you a lot of fun with your own creations and stay safe. Cheers.